Recently, a TV adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Sandman came to Netflix. A lot of fans have loved the show. This week, we offer an opposing view. Emmet talks with comics commentator Elizabeth Sandifer on why she, and Emmet, feel the Sandman show is vastly inferior to the original comics. Sandifer goes into the circumstances in which Gaiman originally created Sandman, how the show works around Sandman's superhero comics past, and more. First, if you appreciate the work we do on Deconstructing Comics and our other podcasts and want bonus content, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Our monthly issue-by-issue look at 1960s Amazing Spider-Man comics is available to patrons, chipping in at least $4 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
Hello, welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Emmet Acuna in a small town outside of Melbourne. Today, I wanted to do something a little different. I want to talk about a television show. It's a television show that's been on the way to some sort of screen, big or little, for almost 3 decades now. And that little television show dropped on Netflix with 10 episodes. At the time of recording, an 11th episode dropped, which I was very irritated by because I couldn't get to see it. So we're not going to be reviewing the 11th episode of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman over on Netflix. We're going to be talking about the 10 episodes that dropped the initial season. And to help me do this and unpack the Sandman of it all, I've asked Elizabeth Sandifer, writer, comics scholar, commentator, author of Last War in Albion, Neo Reaction, A Basilisk, and Britain, A Prophecy. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Hello, a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to have you on. Now, Last War in Albion, I think every person interested in the history of comics should read this, because you covered in exhaustive detail the magical war between Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. It's a fantastic read. It's still going. I understand that you recently dropped a further volume of it, which is going to be concerned with the Sandman too, so the timing works out.
I'm serializing the 4th volume on Sandman on my Patreon, and I'm serializing the 3rd volume, which is on Alan Moore and Grant Morrison's work, basically from 1988 to 1993, so after the period from when Alan Moore finishes Watchmen and starts his post-Watchmen work, up through where he starts at Image Comics and declares himself to be a magician, and the period where Grant Morrison starts at DC with Animal Man, through when they depart the British scene entirely with their last 2000 AD work, The Summer Offensive, and fuck off on a bunch of world travel that will take them to Kathmandu and be abducted by aliens. So that's Volume 3 serializing on my blog. And then my patrons are far ahead of that. They have all of Volume 3 already and have started getting Volume 4 on Sandman.
Wonderful. It's well worth a read. And you also are producing a comic with your husband, Britain, A Prophecy, as well?
Yes, I'm writing that. My husband is doing the art. That's you're going to notice a theme here. That's our take on a kind of 90s Vertigo comic. We've got fairies battling for control over Britain in 1987. And I'll spoil our first issue for you. It ends with the bad guy decapitating Margaret Thatcher and staging a coup to take over Britain in 1987. And then things get even more, intense and dangerous from there.
That sounds perfectly Vertigo-esque. That's exactly what reading a Vertigo comic in the early 90s felt like.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of my starting point was, what did every British invasion comics writer want to do in about 1988, 1989 that they couldn't have gotten away with then and that they could now? And I decided the answer was having someone triumphantly hold up Margaret Thatcher's severed head and proclaim that they're taking over Britain.
Well,
so I started there. And I've been building the story up from there. And my husband is doing incredible work on art. He's really nailing like that kind of British clean style is what I call it. That kind of Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland in the 80s up through like Steve Dillon and Jamie McKelvey, that whole tradition of just like ultra clean art. My husband has been nailing a style like that. It's been getting better and better every issue. We've got a Patreon for that we're about to drop the 4th issue for people there.
Oh, look, I need to read this.
I'll tease it one more. The 4th issue has a completely illicit, unlicensed cameo of a minor character from Grant Morrison's Captain Clyde, where cheekily playing with all sorts of like little references to obscure British comics, and where low-key stealing a character from Grant Morrison's Captain Clyde and figuring they're not going to sue us for it.
No. After all,
they're gonna laugh about that.
It's only treatment in kind after their whole Michael Moorcock situation. I think this is fine.
Exactly. Our character is no more Ellen, goddess of. Well, actually, she's literally called Ellen, goddess of the old tracks and standing stones. But in any case, she's no more the minor character of Captain Clyde than Gideon Stargrave is Jerry Cornelius. Exactly.
Very good. No,
we have jumped straight to some deep cuts here. We should actually make it to Sandman.
Why not? Yes, indeed. But one last point on yourself, and then we'll get stuck into the whole Sandman of it all. So our great, very generous host of this podcast, Tim, reached out to me when I mentioned I was interviewing you, and he sent me an email and he said, could you ask her a question for me? Her bio on Bloomsbury.com says she publishes and blogs about the psychic history of comics and science fiction. What does psychic history mean? Right.
So that's talking about Last War in Albion. The conceit of Last War in Albion is that the rivalry between Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, which generally is considered to be not unreasonably a kind of gossipy feud over who influenced who and who stole ideas from who, that doesn't have a lot of depth to it and is mostly neither of their finest hour. Last War in Albion says, no, it is actually literally a magical war between the two great wizards of the late 20th and early 21st century, for the soul of what Britain and the 21st century will be, and that these two comics writers are in fact great and powerful wizards battling through through what Alan Moore calls idea space to just find the nature of the 21st century. That's what I mean by psychic history.
I love it. And I do really enjoy the conceit of the book, or the volumes, if it were, as it were. And I love your detailed approach. As I said, it's exhaustive. You've dug up so much material and so much content to source this magical war. But
right, it's something I work very closely from primary sources. I try to be very, very thorough in my history, but it's also a project that suggests unironically that Watchmen was an accidental magic spell that ended the Cold War, and that occasionally offers quotes from William Blake that are sourced. I'll just have a quote, and then it'll say, "Said William Blake in a 2021 seance." So yeah, it's both very, very detailed, but also goes on at a weird angle. I describe it as comics history written as though it's like a Game of Thrones style epic fantasy.
They are magicians, and they are actually practicing magic through art.
I mean, they are absolutely doing something that they are calling magic, and I think it is interesting to ask what that might mean for both of them.
Yeah, I have a lot of time for Padraig O'Malley and his research into Moore and what he's tried to do, but at the same time,
he's an absolute demon of finding those details. He's
really
been
good
tremendously helpful. No, he's been tremendously helpful to Last War in Albion on countless occasions.
It's that moment where you go, okay, you need to actually explore the metaphysics of what this is, as opposed to simply saying, and then he said this. There is actually, we need to travel some way with these subjects, because I think they're earnest in what they're saying.
Right. No, I mean, the whole kind of conceit of Last Born Albion is that I take both Alan Moore and Grant Morrison's assertions about magic absolutely literally. I believe that Alan Moore has all of the magical experiences that he describes. I believe that I believe that, Jerusalem is a literal work of magic that describes how it works within the text. Likewise, I believe that Grant Morrison was in fact abducted by aliens in Kathmandu. All of this happened, and I am writing the history of it as best I can from the sources available.
Excellent, wonderful stuff. Well, that is I think, a fruitful digression, but an digression nonetheless. Let's get back to the Sandman on Netflix. Now,
yes,
this has been, as I said, almost 3 decades in coming. The success of Sandman the comic, and Neil Gaiman's popularization and his ability to capture that moment, really did not just catapult the comic to the top of the bestseller list, win awards, all the rest of it, but there was almost instantly, there was talk of adaptation. There was talk of a movie. I sat in a bookstore in Hodges Figgis in Dublin in 1996, listening to Neil Gaiman sort of dismissively talk about the attempts to adapt it to film, make it a superhero movie. He's been stewarding this book through to adaptation for all this time.
Right. He's both very vocally wanted an adaptation of it, and very vocally has not wanted most of the adaptations that people have tried to make.
Exactly. So, after all this time, now that we've seen it, how do you feel it worked as an adaptation of The Sandman?
I want to back up. I think you need to back up first and ask, what is it you want from an adaptation of The Sandman?
True.
Because it is clear that Neil Gaiman wants a particular thing from an adaptation of The Sandman. He wants a relatively faithful adaptation. He wants to include as many of the classic, iconic moments from his comic that he can. He wants to, adapt all the little bits and pieces and subplots as faithfully as he can. He's willing to make, see changes be made to make it work for the medium, but mostly he wants to be very faithful to the spirit and, more to the point, structure of the original comic. I don't necessarily know why you would want that. That is not a thing that I think is a terribly valuable way to adapt across media. I think that Neil Gaiman has form, being a bit ill-advised on this front. I know to the repeatedly raised behind-the-scenes rumors that Neil Gaiman helped push Brian Fuller out of American Gods because he didn't like the degree to which Brian Fuller was departing from the novel and wanted a more faithful adaptation. I think it's notable that American Gods got much worse when Brian Fuller left, that it was a better show when it was departing from Gaiman's text a little more aggressively. And I think Sandman has a lot of the same problems as late American Gods. I think it is doing the best job it can with something that isn't a good idea in the first place.
I think that's really reasonable. And I also find it interesting that you cite American Gods, because in some of the praising of this show, I've seen people praising it criticize American Gods for straying from the text. Whereas I really enjoyed that first season, and then it just fell off a cliff.
And I mean, I guess the thing that I have to say here is, it's done very well on Netflix. It has gotten very good reviews from a number of people. There is clearly an audience that wants the comic they enjoyed decades ago, more or less faithfully adapted into a new medium. I have concerns about these people. That's a little bit vicious, but I have concerns that this is something that we have largely manufactured a desire for in American 21st century capitalism. I think that there are larger problems. My disinterest in what Neil Gaiman is doing with this series is frankly a larger disinterest with what Neil Gaiman is doing with his late career and what a lot of the corporate owned intellectual property franchises are being used to do in the 21st century.
I listened to a panel of reviewers on NPR in tears over this, in tears. So Yes, there is a sense of extremes at work here that I find odd, and I find the thought of talking about this show particularly loaded, given that landscape and given the criticism of the show I've largely seen has been founded on this awful sort of racist narrative, which I don't think we should even introduce here.
No, I
it's
have
fruitful,
zero interest in acknowledging. If your problem with the show is that they made Death a black woman, go fuck yourself.
In effect.
Go fuck yourself, you racist motherfucker. That is my response to that entire line of criticism. I hope a meteor hits you.
But I think there is something really interesting about the line you've immediately identified, which was how faithful this is to the word of the text as an adaptation.
Right. I mean, it departs in limited ways. Most of them appear to be around the idea of structuring for television. A couple of them are what you might call good-natured updates. I think 24 Hours is particularly interesting in this regard, and I'd love to spend some time talking about that episode in particular. But actually, where I want to start is the Death episode, The Sound of Her Wings. Because that one is, I think, the weirdest episode because it is very blatantly two episodes in a trench coat. Like, it is not even a single episode of TV. It is a bifurcated two-parter that adapts two different comics that both happen to feature the character of Death and happen to be within the two arcs that this series of Sandman has decided to adapt. And they are just kind of stapled together in the middle for no particular reason. It is a bizarre structure. It makes next to no sense as television. It only makes sense in as much as the product being sold by Netflix Sandman is, here is Sandman exactly the way you read it 30 years ago. Only now it's television. And I want to stress that I am someone for whom Sandman was huge growing up. Sandman was life-changing for me. Sandman introduced me to whole new waves of how you could do art, whole new waves of genre. It introduced me to writers like Alan Moore and Grant Morrison, who obviously are a bit of an influence on me. You know, Britain of Prophecy is very much my attempt to do a comic that might feel for someone today the way Sandman felt for me at, 13, 14, 15. This was huge for me. This was very, very important. But man, is it weird to just see two comic books that were important to me 20 years ago turned into television scripts and stapled together like that. That is weird, and I don't know why anyone wants that.
And it's interesting as well because Curly Howell Baptiste's performance as Death is one of the things that I think everyone generally agrees is a highlight of the show.
She does pretty good. She certainly does a lot better than I think Tom Sturridge does with Dream.
We'll get to him. But I feel, as you say, because you stitch these two stories into one episode, I feel like we've been cheated out of more Kirby. I want more Kirby.
Right. I mean, and obviously we'll get her. And it's notable there's not actually that much Sandman, not much Death in Sandman itself. I think she only appears in something like a dozen or so issues of the entire comic. Like, she's actually really not in much of the comic. There's a quote from Neil Gaiman where he talks about, whenever I considered using Death, I thought of Marlon Brando getting paid $4 million to appear in just 10 minutes of Superman the movie. So I would bring Death on only when I really needed her, and I mentally paid her $4 million for each appearance, and I made sure that she used the money. She's only in 20 issues of Sandman, and many of those are just very brief cameos. So, in that regard, only giving a little bit of her is very faithful to the comic. But, so, I don't mind the lack of Death. But, man, that is just such a weird, structured episode. It feels less like it's trying to be television and more like it's trying... I feel like almost all of this first season of Sandman was weirdly obsessed with the problem that a 22-page comic book adapts to about 25 minutes of television, and they have a 50-minute show.
Yeah, that's fair.
Every episode is built around how do we turn a 2-page comic book into an episode coherently. They do better at it when they get to Doll's House, when they feel a little more free to take it apart and put it back together again structurally. But those first 6 episodes that are all more or less adapting single issues of Preludes and Nocturnes are weird. They are weird and jankily paced, and none of them quite work.
Yes, and also because so much is focused on the text and the talking heads aspect of some of these comics, I felt as well we were missing out. Yeah.
And when they make changes, they're weirdly arbitrary feeling. I was really struck. Episode 4, A Hope in Hell, that adapts issue 4, has really what in Sandman itself is like arguably the first big iconic scene of Neil Gaiman's career. Like the first time Gaiman does a scene where like everyone who reads it in trade hits that scene and they're like, shit, this is good. That psychic duel between Dream and Karanzan, where they each are asserting themselves to be things, and they kind of escalate from like, I am a snake, I am a hunter, up through like, I am anthrax, I am a planet, and finally to like, I am the universe, I am anti-life, and Dream wins it with I am hope. And it's a great scene in the comic. It's great. And they sandbag it. They over milk I am hope to an absolutely appalling degree. They make it just really clear that they think that I am hope line is the coolest, most clever thing, when it's actually quite underplayed in the comic. They don't make it a battle between Dream and this rando demon Karanzan. They give it to Lucifer to build up Lucifer better so they can use her in the next season as the big bad of Season of Mists, or at least undercut that in Season of Mists. But the result of that is that they really sandbag Lucifer and make Lucifer look like a goddamn idiot.
Yeah.
Whereas Lucifer maintains quite a lot of menace and power in the original.
And is shown to be manipulating the other Lords of Hell. Like Lucifer in the comic is in a bit of a detente with there's 2 other Lords of Hell. And we don't meet one of them until the end of the series. Roger Allam's amazing voice comes in as the sort of abyss-like creature.
As the questionably animated Azazel, yes.
So I'm sure there was a budgetary reason for that. But
I kind of like that Azazel looks like he fell straight out of a Spawn comic. There's a certain inadvertent honesty there that I don't feel like was the emotional honesty they were going for. Like the fealty to the original comic, but I kind of like in its accidental fealty. But yeah, like that's just so weirdly structured, and so many weird decisions are being made in that, and they are all made according to a aesthetic logic that I just have very little sympathy for.
Coming up, the circumstances in which Gaiman originally created Sandman, how the show works around Sandman's superhero comics past, and more. But first, a reminder to join us for 20th Century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. Every month, patrons donating $4 a month or more also get a full-length podcast episode reviewing an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. Tim and Paul race to the scene, where a 1960s Batman TV episode needs analyzing. The show's attitude toward civics.
A loyal taxpayer stooping to criminal methods.
Toward women.
A dish.
Toward time management.
All in all, Batman, you've been pretty busy.
As well as the history, the casting, and more. Tune in via iTunes or Stitcher, or visit tothebatpoles.libsyn.com for
To the Batpoles.
And there is, again, this idea of interpretation, because Dringenberg, his art as well, you had that sort of Bosch-like quality to Hell.
It was great.
Which we miss a lot of. A lot of it's in smoke and
although
sort of parking
that
lots.
issue was drawn by Sam Keith, not Dringenberg. It's actually. Sam Keith is great for it. Sam Keith has this kind of slight Todd McFarlane cartooniness to it. His Hell is just really weird and eccentric. He didn't quite vibe with Neil Gaiman, so he didn't stick on more than 5 issues of the comic. But he draws this really weird sadomasochistic hell that's really like fleshy and unsettling, and it's great. It's absolutely great. There's this double-page spread of all of the demons standing in hell, and there's just some great cartooning. It's not just sort of the foggy budget saver of the TV shows.
Yes, but as you're saying, like Corazon has this like MC battle with Sandman, and you're right. Keith's depiction of Corazon is incredible.
Right, and it's much more underplayed. Like, they don't try to milk out the moment of like Dream is on his last legs and is very near doomed, and will he make it out of this? It's actually quite underplayed. Like, there's, Corazon gets this, the I am anti-life, the beast of judgment, I am the dark at the end of everything, the end of universes, gods, worlds of everything. And what will you be then, Dream Lord? And Dream just stands there, arms crossed, no delay, deadpans, I am hope. And it's nice and underplayed, and that's why it works, and the TV show just milks it. It milks it until that line becomes the most trite, overburdened thing possible. It's Neil Gaiman taking a victory lap as opposed to telling a story. And that's actually, I think, my problem with the whole show, is it's Neil Gaiman taking a victory lap. And Sandman is a hungry Neil Gaiman trying to establish a life outside the confines of Scientology. No, I mean, his biography, I think this is actually key to understanding Neil Gaiman early on, is that Neil Gaiman was raised by the UK head of public relations for Scientology, one of the most powerful Scientologists in the UK organization. Neil Gaiman had a very, very weird childhood. If you've ever read his novel, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, the inciting incident in that is a boarder at his house that commits suicide in the family car. That boarder was a Scientology student. There are some distinctly suspicious circumstances around his death, like that he called and canceled his plane ticket home before killing himself and wrote a suicide note that repeatedly said Scientology is definitely not to blame for my suicide. Like, really overemphasized that point to a creepy degree. And that's the inciting incident of Ocean at the End of the Lane. And Ocean at the End of the Lane takes the Scientology out. It doesn't mention that this guy was in his father's infamously abusive cult. But that happened. There's a recording of a 7-year-old Neil Gaiman kind of dronishly repeating the Scientology talking points in the most, like, I am repeating specific long sentences that I have dutifully memorized. That is creepy as hell. Neil Gaiman had a fucked up, and I'm willing to say abusive childhood. I do not think it is possible to grow up in the Church of Scientology and not have a childhood that is abusive in some way. Scientology is simply too abusive an organization. He's writing Sandman married to a woman that he met through Scientology, and he is trying to get famous enough as a writer that he can chart his escape from his abusive upbringing. That is what his entire beginning career as a writer is about. That is what the Sandman is about. He is taking a big, hungry, desperate swing. He is trying desperately to impress the world as much as Alan Moore did a few years earlier with Swamp Thing and Watchmen. He's trying to do it more. He wants to be as impressive as Alan Moore, but instead of walking away and doing weird indie stuff, he wants to be the massive comics pop star that Alan Moore decided he didn't want to be. And Sandman is a desperate, constantly trying to impress you and sell the deal effort from someone who is frankly one of the most savvy businessmen in the history of comics. The irony is that if Neil Gaiman learned one thing from Scientology, it was the ruthlessly efficient business instincts of Scientology. He makes a comic that is precision engineered to hit absolutely as big as it did. It is hungry. It is ambitious. It is trying to shock and charm the world, and I think it is good enough to do it. It is a staggering work of comics art. And the problem is, the Sandman TV show is none of that. The Sandman TV show is a rich Neil Gaiman who hasn't written a book in a decade, whose entire career right now appears to be making television adaptations of his old hits for lots and lots of money, taking a victory lap. And I think it is the most boring, cynical thing imaginable. I simply do not care about Neil Gaiman's victory lap the way I do about hungry Neil Gaiman trying to knock my socks off.
Yep.
To go on a bit of a rant for you.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that actually speaks to some dissatisfaction people have had with the author's career lately. There is this sense of repeating old ideas, circling back to old territories, and certainly in the comic space, these sort of Vertigo life support, the Sandman Presents books that came out in the last decade, that was chilling for me. That was the vision of Karen Berger has well and truly been left behind here.
The Sandman Universe Presents. Like, wow, what an upsetting chain of words there. And what's really cynical is this is the second time he's done it, because Neil Gaiman had nominally authorized Caitlin Kiernan's series, The Dreaming. She was one of the first prominent trans writers in mainstream comics at Marvel or DC, along with Rachel Pollack on Doom Patrol, following Grant Morrison. And she wrote, I think, 60 or 75 issues of The Dreaming. I don't think she wrote all of them, but she wrote most of this series, which was Sandman without Morpheus. It was just noodling around the margins of Sandman and telling additional stories. It wasn't as good as Sandman. It was a bit of a cynical corporate cash-in, but it had its moments. It had its charms. It was historically important for having this trans writer on it. And part of its sales pitch was always that Neil Gaiman endorsed it. And then it finishes, and a couple of years later, here comes Neil Gaiman curates The Sandman Universe Present, and it completely ignores The Dreaming. He just does it again. He just does the, yes, here's my official Neil Gaiman endorsed Sandman follow-up by these other people, ignoring the previous official Neil Gaiman endorsed Sandman follow-up. What the fuck? How cynical, hackish, Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, why not just have a miniseries between them called Crisis on Infinite Dreamings where you reboot it, if that's what you're going to do?
That arguably that was Overture.
You're right. That is a very fair description of a volume infinity of the Sandman 30th Anniversary Collection, Sandman Overture, which is a real book that exists. And appears to have amounted to Neil Gaiman sending very, very late scripts to J.H. Williams pleading, can you be brilliant? Because I wasn't.
We interviewed J.H. Williams on here about Promethea. He is such a sweetheart. And
my God, I have never met him, but I've communicated with him a little bit. I have a 2-page spread from Promethea on my wall, actually.
Oh my goodness!
I'm sitting right near it. It's one of the hand painted background issues from the Chesed issue of the Kabbalah sequence, the one with the 4 wands behind it, where Sophie meets her dead father, and it's beautiful. It's one of like my prized possessions in life. Promethea was huge to me. I love J.H. Williams' work. He is the only good thing about Sandman Overture. No, I'm sorry. Todd Klein acquits himself.
Of course,
as ever on this. Todd Klein, the most legendary lettering job in all of comics. Todd Klein on Sandman.
Yeah. And I think that's something that whenever Todd Klein's name comes up, it's always eminently professional. Always gets the job done. You know,
they really need to rename the just based on the fact that he's won it a majority of the time. The Eisner Award for best lettering should just be the Todd Klein Eisner Award for best lettering at this point. He's literally won more than half of them.
Well, I think we should get back to the show because we've absolutely filled out the landscape around it.
I'll make a transition here, which, when you have one of the most legendary lettering jobs of all time, I admit, how do you translate that into spoken dialogue is a hell of a challenge, to which Tom Sturridge is a shockingly feeble effort.
Yeah, I felt he got stronger towards the end of the season, but those opening episodes were a bit rough for me.
Yeah, I mean, he is just saddled with how do we make him have... They are trying the fundamentally contradictory goals of how do we cast the next Robert Pattinson and how do we capture the Byronic grandeur of Todd Klein's lettering. And you do not do those two things at once unless you can get actual fucking Robert Pattinson, who could have done the job.
Well, my pitch was Irish actor Barry Keoghan, because he's just got this...
Also a great choice.
He's got this eeriness about him, and you always feel slightly on edge when he's on screen. I think he's a great performer, and that's what you need from Sandman. You need a sense of some danger, threat.
I just feel like if you're going to try to imitate Edward Cullen that hard, your only option is to get Edward Cullen. Like, don't settle for second best.
Yeah, and when you have the likes of David Thewlis just striding to the show, acting the hell out of everybody, and then leaving the show, like the air escapes.
Acting the hell out of a part that gave him literally nothing to work with.
He managed to eat ice cream threateningly.
It's a hell of a job, given that eating ice cream was the most threatening thing the script asked of him.
And I saw there was some discussion of, is it Rosemary's the lady who gives him the drive? I think she gives him the drive to the diner. So that scene between the two of them is fantastic. It's just really tense. If you read the comic, it actually, I think, lifts the material from the comic. And also the comic ends with him murdering her.
Right, and having redone her as a black woman, they make the tasteful decision to not murder her.
Yes.
It does defang Dr. D a bit. But the whole program of this show is they want to defang Dr. D. Like, he is a supervillain in the comic. He is an old, trashy, obscure supervillain who is redone as a sociopath who just wants to destroy the world for the fun of it. And they go full out on the horror of, he is just an I want to destroy the world sociopath. And it's at least chilling. It's actually one of the best efforts at, like, taking a dopey old forgotten character and turning him into something serious and awful of anyone. Like, this whole school of thought that begins with Alan Moore on Swamp Thing and Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, Dr. Destiny is one of the best efforts ever. I don't know what they think they're doing with the TV show, because they defang him into nothingness.
It's sort of the moment where the comic book sort of shrugged off, or it was just processing that sort of superhero heritage the Sandman has. The show doesn't have that. Initially, Sandman, Preludes and Nocturnes is trying to be a kind of cracked mirror superhero comic. And they get away from that roughly by the end of Doll's House. Doll's House, that arc in the original comic, actually does a low-key tie-in to Jamie Delano's contemporarily published Hellblazer. It also does a tie-in to Rick Veitch's Swamp Thing with Matthew the Raven, who is a minor Swamp Thing character who dies and migrates into Sandman, and there's Dream shows up in an issue of Swamp Thing. Like, it was at that moment of history really tied in with the larger DC landscape and was nominally a superhero book. Sandman meets the Justice League at one point in the comic. We have a glimpse of Apocalypse as well. We have a glimpse of Kirby's Apocalypse with there's this whole Fourth World riff. And I get that they weren't allowed to use any DC superhero characters, including John Constantine, which, with that one,
they do brilliantly. They give us Jenna Coleman's heavenly Joanna Constantine, who desperately I want DC to pick up the gauntlet and do a Joanna Constantine comic now. Give me a gender-swapped Constantine. Let me write a gender-swapped Constantine, frankly. That is a great character. But their adaptations around losing the superhero aspect of it for Dr. Destiny just defang him. He has this weird, pointless motivation of, I want to expose all of the lies we tell. And that's just not scary in the same way that I want to drive everyone mad and kill people for the fun of it is.
Yeah, it turns into his whole motivation is mommy issues because he's upset that his mother lied to him.
Right. And this comes to a head. I've been circling around the 24 Hours adaptation, which, I said that there are 3 issues in Preludes and Nocturne where Gaiman hits it out of the park and builds his reputation. There's the Hell issue. There's the first appearance of Death, which, if you look back at the original issue, they know full well is going to get reprints and spike on the secondary volume. That comic actually opens with 3 pages of pull quotes from various writers about how great Sandman is, and then has a several-page recap of the first 7 issues, and then finally goes into introducing Death. That comic knows it is a hit. It knows it is about to convert a ton of new readers. And in between them is the 24 Hours issue, the one where Dream is barely in it and Dr. Destiny just kills a bunch of people sadistically in a diner. And it is this roller coaster of horror. It is an emotionally sadistic, nasty, just vicious horror comic that is unlike anything else Neil Gaiman has done in his career practically. He is almost never actually that dark and nasty and horrific. And it's great. It is chilling. It sticks with every reader of the comic, but it's not a direction Gaiman wants to go in. Gaiman actually wants to be, this kind of avuncular, look at the magic of storytelling, kids. Let's make goth girls happy. Kindly old storytelling grandpa. And he's great at it. Credit due, he sold millions of copies to the teenage mall goths of America in the 90s and early aughts. He is definitive for a subculture. It is, I don't want to sneeze at that at all. But he decides that 24 Hours, he decides pretty quickly in his career that 24 Hours isn't the direction he wants to go in. He kind of leaves that for Mark Millar instead. Mark Millar spent his entire career trying to write 24 Hours. And man, the TV show, you can see him trying to prettify 24 Hours so hard. They just file all the rough edges off of that, except for the bare minimum. You still get a nice jump scare eye gouge moment at the very end.
I was not a fan of that. Let me tell you, that's the few triggers I have is ocular trauma. Really?
Oh, and the ocular trauma, and it's still not as upsetting as it is in the comic. They move it to the waitress.
Betsy,
yeah,
isn't that her name? Yeah.
Yes, whereas in the comic, it's just out of nowhere. Judith, the young lesbian woman, is just taking 2 knives. It's I want to see it, doctor. I trust you. I will see the glory. And then you get the eye gouge moment, and there's a nice splatter of blood, and it's, God. I can see it, sweet Lord. I can see the glory. It's like the blood is running down her face. And it's really horrific and fucked up. And then she's in the next panel just dead and with skewers in her eyes. And it's really upsetting and really traumatic. And they whittle it down to just the bare minimum of the jump scare so that they can have the comic's iconic moment, but there's none of just the awful cat and mouse sadism of the original. And there are things to object to there. Obviously they introduce a lesbian character just to kill her horribly. There is a lot of gross corrective rape and sexual trauma throughout 24 Hours that is tacky and over the top. They also dial back a sequence in the original where the character who gets changed into the cook. In the original, he is an alcoholic trucker who had an affair with Bet. And in the original, there is a scene where he is hammering nails into his hand while Bet stands by and holds the nails for him. And he confesses at great length how he, when he was in prison for embezzlement, he met Bet's estranged gay son who got picked up for prostitution in Gotham after he knifed his pimp. And he says, you could have him for a packet of cigarettes. Hammers a nail into his hand with a bloody bam. Bet. I did. And it's just like so awful and over the top and exploitative. It's this garish exploitation horror. Like I meant it when I offered that Mark Millar comparison. But it turns out when you take that core of really effective, well done edgelord horror out of that story, there's not actually anything there. It's just sort of a vapid, what's the point? Why did we just spend 40 minutes on this before Dream swans in for the last 10 to have the big fight scene?
Yeah, and the show renders it, I felt a bit uncomfortable because it's implied almost that he's having an affair with the son in the show.
Oh, it's not implied. It's made very explicit, and they just take the rape out of it. Like it's not coercive prison sex.
Exactly.
To feed his addiction. So it's slightly tidier.
I felt it was upsetting to me because I felt as if they were suggesting, the implication for me was, oh, this is better, and I was like, what are we cheering for here? What's good about this? It bothered me because it's still the age difference and everything, and the fact that she thinks she's in a relationship with him, and then he's going upstairs and having sex with her son. I was like, this is creepy. This is.
Right, but it still just feels like a pale imitation of the original.
Yeah.
It's both too much and too little.
Exactly, yeah.
And I don't know, I don't see the point of it. It's very hollowed out. It doesn't have the... it feels like an apology for the original. And for all the problems the original had, I don't want to say that the original was a flawless and unproblematic piece of work. It at least was very honest to what comics were like and what people thought was cool in 1988. It is an extremely successful 1988 comic, and either don't do it because you don't want to do a 1988 comic. You want to do something for the present moment, and that kind of slasher horror, exploitation gruesomeness doesnn's appeal anymore. Or do it and go for the horror and just have one episode that is there to make people think that, Ari Aster's Hereditary was a nice, cuddly movie. Go for one or the other, but don't half-ass it.
So 24 Hours, we're not saying this is one of the greatest hours of television this year.
I am aggressively not. And anyone who does...
That was a Guardian headline.
You're really... Oh, my God. Well, I bet that reviewer is really enjoying She-Hulk.
See, I reached out to you to have this discussion, and I really thought... I was hoping you'd keep me honest. I was hoping you'd keep me in check, but no, you just ran away with it, and now I'm like going, "Oh, okay." We both didn't like.
Yeah, no. I unfortunately am not going to be nice to this TV series, even as I want to stress. I'm writing about Sandman on my Patreon, and I am being very openly impressed with Sandman. Part of what I'm being impressed with is its business sense, is the kind of cynical practicality of Neil Gaiman as a writer and in terms of his career, in part because I think that's the really interesting way to compare him to Alan Moore and Grant Morrison. But I have a lot of respect for Sandman as a comic. I really want to stress that I have nothing but love and fond memory. The comparison I have made about Sandman before I feel like it is a great first boyfriend of comics. I've outgrown it. I am into stuff that is harder and weirder and more mature than Sandman, as I think I should be. Sandman is written for smart teenagers, and I'm 40 in a couple of weeks. I should have outgrown Sandman. But as a comic, as a gateway into alternative cultures, as a gateway into goth music, as a gateway into other things, like, through Sandman, I got into tarot and Rachel Pollack, because Rachel Pollack did the Vertigo tarot tie-in with Sandman. Through Sandman, I got into Alan Moore, because obviously Sandman is homaging Alan Moore. Through Sandman, I got into a number of literary writers that get referenced. I took another look at Midsummer Night's Dream and Tempest because of Sandman. Sandman was a gateway to a ton of genuinely interesting stuff that then branched out further. Alan Moore got me into Ian Sinclair and psychogeography and J.G. Ballard. It was a huge gateway to a ton of really weird and interesting stuff for me. But it was a good first boyfriend. And it's a boyfriend you see him on the street and you feel nothing but warm feelings, but you've outgrown him and you don't really need to go spend a lot of time with him anymore. It's kind of the lovable himbo of comics. And I have a tremendous amount of regard for that. I don't have that kind of regard for the TV series at all.
I think that's a beautiful place to end this. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really well put. And
thank you. Absolutely my pleasure.
And thank you again for joining us on the podcast. In the notes for this episode, we'll have your link tree as well. And that'll have links to both my website and Patreon, where I'm doing that History of British Comics stuff, and to where you can check out the Vertigo-style comic I'm doing with my husband. Yes, I folks listening, I genuinely thought we were going to be debating this show more, but no, we're in lockstep on this one, I think.
glad to provide a nice definitive viewpoint, or sorry to cheat you out of a nice vigorous debate if you were hoping that I'd come in and praise it. But no, I have no time or interest for this kind of TV show. And actually, the note I want to end it is Gaiman, like Moore, like Morrison, like all of these 80s British writers came to prominence because they took old things and did something new with them. And it is terribly sad to see the most prominent of those writers, Neil Gaiman, spend his late career taking his old stuff and doing it again, especially when you look at, Alan Moore starting a new career as a novelist effectively and moving into a new medium. When you see Grant Morrison still in late career doing weird avant-garde stuff and trying to be new and push themselves, it's just sad to see Neil Gaiman being such a lazy writer as this.
Find links to everything Elizabeth Sandifer is doing at linktr.ee/crossroadscomics. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read it and record our critique. Next week on Critiquing Comics, the latest by one of our favorites, David Dye. He sent us Amazing Tales number 5, and Adam and I will discuss it next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.